Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us in 2023 to become trained in the NeuroAffective Relational Model. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. If you are a licensed mental health practitioner, you can join the Level 2 NARM Therapist training. This Level 2 training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and C-PTSD. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. For today's episode, we're delighted to share with you a glimpse into the NARM Inner Circle. The Inner Circle is an online learning program for those interested in joining an international community of helping professionals who are passionate about healing complex trauma. The Inner Circle provides ongoing, in-depth learning from NARM creator Dr. Laurence Heller and Senior Trainer Brad Kammer, as well as other NARM faculty. As a gift to our listeners, we offer this special topic webinar with the folks from all around the world gathered to learn more about healing complex trauma, with the focus of the discussion being upon heartfulness. In this webinar, Larry and Brad explore how NARM distinguishes mindfulness and heartfulness, how developmental trauma changes a child's relationship to their heart, as well as the role of child consciousness when an adult closes their heart. Dr. Heller also speaks to the armoring that happens to those that learn to close their hearts as children. We hope you enjoy this special episode of Transforming Trauma on Heartfulness.
So welcome everyone for our August Inner Circle topic webinar. This is another nice topic to be exploring. Even though we're in the field of trauma here, we're going to be focusing on heartfulness.
Actually, I'd like to say, because we're in the field of trauma, we're focusing on the theme of heartfulness. Because particularly when we're talking about developmental trauma in general, we're talking about heartbreak of all different kinds and how people disconnect from their hearts in order to manage particularly relational and developmental trauma. So Brad and I both see it as really a fundamental theme here in the work that we do.
Yeah. And we'll be getting into that more together. So what we like to do is we like to start with an exercise. We invite you to join us if you'd like to, and I'll read it to you, and then we'll give you a little time to reflect, which is we invite you to reflect on a time when you felt it was necessary to shut down your heart with someone or in a specific situation. So an experience either with a person or in a situation where you felt that it was necessary to shut down your heart. We'll just give you a little time to reflect on that and noticing your internal experience as you reflect. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add here.
Just to mention that Brad and my orientation in these exercises is always to give you some kind of felt experience. Often we start with the challenging part and end with a more kind of resource, as we might talk about it in our resource exercise. But if you were able to bring up an image of doing that, shutting down your heart, then undoubtedly you could feel how painful it is. The heart, it's the center of who we are. And to shut our heart down for whatever reason is really a painful dynamic. And that's part of what Brad and I are going to address together here today.
So one of the things that we are really trying to bring to this field of trauma and psychology right now is to deepen this understanding of mindfulness. And so, Larry, I thought it'd be good for us to start off by differentiating how we're talking about heartfulness compared to what so many models have been integrating in terms of mindfulness.
Yeah, well, of course, mindfulness is a very important dynamic. It's not an either or, process. And Brad and I made a very conscious decision that we wanted to add this heartfulness piece to the process because mindfulness is just as it describes, it's more in the mind, and it's useful to be able to mindfully be aware of our thoughts and feelings. And we use it to support the disidentification process, particularly what we talk about as somatic mindfulness. But this piece of coming back to your heart is, I'm sure I'm speaking for both of us, is so central to the healing process of coming back from kind of early childhood wounding that, we've all experienced in different degrees. So it's an important distinction, an important kind of, I think, addition to all the important elements that mindfulness actually brings too.
I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about, like, in religion and spiritual traditions, heartfulness. Maybe they don't use that term exactly, but it's so at the core of so many religious and spiritual teachings. And yet in Western psychology, it's been not only not at the heart of it, but often completely disconnected from psychological teaching. So can you speak to that? Because I feel like that's important for us, because there is a resistance to actually bringing the heart into a psychology.
Yeah, unless you're talking about the heart as a physical organ and, part of the polyvagal system or whatever, it does tend to be off limits in our field. I can only speculate on why that might be. It's not scientific enough. And yet we know that not just in spiritual traditions, which are important, there are certainly heart-based spiritual traditions, but just in a general language, we talk about that person has a good heart, or kind-hearted, or it's in so many words that we don't even recognize, hearty, and it's so central. And yet, as Brad's mentioning, it's not brought up in our field. And I think it's a huge loss to the field. The only thing that I can think of, the only person who talked about it specifically years ago was Erich Fromm, and he wrote a number of books, including The Art of Loving. And he brought the heart into the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic process, although he was, of course, then ostracized to some degree for that, because I guess they thought it was not scientific or not something enough. And so I think it's a loss.
Mm-hmm. My experience being trained somatically was interesting, because I actually was really good at tracking my physical sensations, but I noticed that in some way that actually even became a bypass to connecting to my emotions. And so when I was introduced to your work initially, I just so appreciated. And I think you actually challenged me at different times about really kind of redirecting the focus back to the emotional centers. I know there's a lot of people that have been trained in somatic work. I wonder if maybe you can speak a little bit more to that, because you've been in this field for so long.
Well, you might even remember there was a working I did with the guy in the training where you started in Los Angeles many years ago. And he was well trained in somatic experiencing and mindfulness and all kinds of body-oriented psychotherapies and physical therapies, body-oriented therapies. And that same dynamic was so strong in him, is that every time I'd ask him what he's experiencing, he would track exquisitely his sensations in his body. And at a certain point, you may remember, I said, we're going to make the body off limits so that you just can track what you're feeling emotionally, ultimately what you're feeling in your heart. And it was like for him, as well as for many people that we both experienced coming in from, many regulation models, that many people are able to really track their sensations and completely miss their emotions. And it can actually be used defensively as a way of not feeling your emotions. And so it was important, and has been important for Brad and me, for these individuals who come in from other traditions, and certainly many others, Continuum, there are a whole other series of models that are really sensation oriented, and to help them kind of disconnect or shift the paradigm internally for them to begin tracking emotional responses. And really, so much of what's going on physically is driven by emotional conflict. And so we want always in NARM trying to address, the underlying causes, not just the symptoms that people are experiencing.
So I think it's important to drill down into one thing you said, because it's potentially kind of evocative, although I love what you said, which is that we were using this example of kind of tracking sensations, but it could be also intellectualizing, or could be a number of things. But you talked about it being a defensive function against connecting to our hearts or our emotions. So I'm imagining there's going to be slides coming up that are going to ask about that, but maybe you could talk a little bit more just right now about what you mean by these defensive functions against connection to heart, like going into our body, being able to connect to our body, or being able to connect cognitively.
Well, I would say really that in terms of if we're ranking things, that the ability to feel our emotions is the most central theme that we're dealing with. It's like when we look at, for example, the whole addiction process and whatever kinds of substances that we're talking about, in general, these individuals are using like the addiction process and other things we've mentioned as a way of not feeling their emotions because they're painful when you've been emotionally wounded, particularly by the people upon whom you depended completely, who you had a love relationship, not just an attachment relationship. And so many of all kinds of defensive, both behaviors and emotional strategies and, internal defenses have to do with avoiding feeling what's going on for us emotionally.
Yeah, to be continued about that.
Mm-hmm.
But so we've already started to kind of imply this, but let's talk a little bit more about really these survival functions of disconnecting and shutting down the heart from a perspective of developmental trauma.
Mm-hmm. So again, I've gone back and forth over the years. When I first started teaching about the core dilemma, I was focusing specifically just on the heart. So like I would talk about the child's need, to protect the love relationship with the parents. And then all of this important understanding coming from attachment work came online. And so even in my own process, well, I want to be current and I want to sound professional. So I started using attachment instead of love, and protect the attachment relationship instead of protecting the love relationship. And that went on for a couple of years. And I was realizing, this is really leaving out this very important thing about love, which is so rarely mentioned in the general field of psychology. I wanted to bring this human experience, which is so central to our lives, back into the therapeutic narrative. And so now Brad and I kind of go back and forth talking about protect the love relationship, protect the attachment relationship. Sometimes we'll use them, even in the same sentence so that people get the full picture, because attachment is more of a behavior. It was originally literally physically attaching, whereas the love relationship touches us where we live, and we live in our hearts. It seems to be true in every culture that I know of, this awareness of how central to human life being connected to our heart is.
There's people at all different levels of our training, or some people that might not even be part of our training yet. So maybe we could break it down, like what happens for a very young child that makes it difficult or feel impossible to stay connected to their hearts?
As we talk about in the training, is like for a child, when their basic psychobiological needs are not being met, and not being met in a chronic way. We talk about this uptick. First, there's protest. That's a healthy, process of trying to communicate to the environment what they need. But then when that protest is not responded to adequately, and these basic psychobiological needs are not being met, then it turns to anger and even rage. And this internally creates an incredible dilemma for the small child, in that children are not able to hold anger, intense anger particularly, and love at the same time. So then it's what we talk about as the splitting process. This comes from a psychoanalytic understanding where children will literally split the image of the parent into the good parent and the bad parent, and the image of themselves into the good self and the bad self. And really the important point that we talk about over and over again, that for a child then to identify with the bad self is their strategy for protecting the image of the parent as being good, which protects the love relationship and protects the attachment relationship. And it comes at great cost, because then they have to shut down their heart. And again, to put it in simple everyday terms, for a child, it's a much better kind of situation, or they can continue hoping, rather than seeing the parents as not having the capacity to love, to see themselves in one variation or another as being unlovable, as being defective. That's what I meant by identifying with the bad self. So the child then starts to split off all of those elements that they feel are not responded to by the environment, by the parents, or responded to negatively by the parents. They disconnect from those. And by not feeling the anger towards the parent, they protect that image of the parent as being good and loving. And as painful as it is to see themselves as unlovable, The alternative is to believe that there is no love in the universe, that the universe is a completely cold and unloving place, because the parents and the family and, that is a child's universe. So it is really central to the NARM process to address this core conflict and this splitting dynamic. And I think we take it to a deeper level than traditional psychoanalysis did, but certainly the basic concept comes from there. And for those of you who are interested in reading more about that, there's a British psychiatrist named Fonagy who writes a lot about this, and he talks particularly in very great detail and depth about splitting the self-image and the object image and how this works. And I've resonated with much of what he said, and I recommend his work. But even before I read him, I had seen that this was such a fundamental piece to the psychological process and felt it was really important to include that in the NARM model.
I was kind of chuckling before because everyone that's part of this call just got a little bit of flavor of how we were writing this book. Because I think we had this exact discussion as we were writing the book, because there's a section that we talk about, for a child, it's better to feel unlovable in a lovable environment than the opposite, because then we lose hope that there's going to be love for us in the universe. The thing I also wanted just to define, you said this statement, we identify with the bad self. And I just think it's important to define for everyone that may not be that far in their training with NARM, that really we're talking about shame, that's the process of shame, that we internalize and personalize the failure from our environment and we make it about us. And so that then becomes what holds the failure, even if our parents are no longer here, or if we're out of the environment, it lives within us by the way that we continually to identify with the bad self in all these different situations.
Yeah.
And what we talk about, Larry and Aline talk about in the first book, and Larry and I talk about in the second book, is that shame is a survival function. And I do think that that's one of the things that's unique about NARM, is the way that we're holding shame versus some of the other models that kind of look at shame as just an emotion. We look at it as a process, as a survival psychobiological process.
Yeah. And as a strategy.
And as a strategy.
Yeah.
So is there more like using the adaptive survival styles you'd like to add around the disconnection from the heart?
Yeah, I mean, I can go through the 5 survival styles and very briefly kind of give a capsule, orientation to each one. So for example, for those individuals who've experienced extreme trauma of various kinds in the earliest part of life, sometimes prenatal or birth or early trauma or early attachment trauma, even if it's not, like, let's say it's early surgeries and it's not because of parents who are unwelcoming, and some parents are unwelcoming, but even when it's not, it's this profound feeling of unwelcomeness is most strongly experienced in the heart center. And the child then really has to, at this point, it's a newborn or an infant, has to shut down their heart in order to survive. So they kind of put their heart on hold in order to maintain and continue living. It's that fundamental. But then as we move through the other survival styles, it's, let's say, for an attunement survival style, they've been relatively welcomed into the world, but the parents see the child's needs as burdening them. They're not welcome to communicate their needs. Sometimes the child is attacked for needing. There are all different scenarios that take place. But then, whereas the connection survival style feels shame about existing and particularly living in their heart, the attunement survival style feels shame about needing. And then they develop and they have profound shame and even a sense of humiliation around expressing their needs directly to other people. Even as adults, this process continues. Again, just as Brad was saying, because of this ongoing shame about needing. I'm sure there are a number of people out there viewing this who can relate to that dynamic, just how hard it is for many of us to communicate our needs directly to other people. And so then we have the trust survival style. And there's the dynamic here is simply that the feeling that you can't depend on, you can't trust the significant others in your life, usually the primary caregivers or the parents. And there's also the experience of having been used often. Used as a pawn by the parents in one way or another, or used narcissistically by one or both of their parents. And this is heartbreaking to a child, to be manipulated and used in this way. And so they shut down their hearts in a very strong way. And at a certain point, their adaptive strategy is, okay, they disconnect from their heart and they'll say, I'll be the one who's in control. I'm going to have the power. And in the therapeutic process, the most important element for working with the trust survival style is to help them get back in touch with their vulnerability, which ultimately means connecting to their heart and their heart emotions. So then the autonomy survival style, they can be welcomed, they can have their needs met, but when they begin to move into the separation individuation process, when they start to develop their own autonomy, again, one or both of the parents is threatened by this or is connected to the child in a way that they're invasive of the child, there are a variety of developmental reasons, but that they don't support the child's developing autonomy and independence. And this autonomy and independence, as Brad and I have talked about in many contexts, is hardwired into the human organism. And when this basic need to establish your own separate self slowly over time, as the child does, when that is blocked by the parents or attacked by the parents, that too is heartbreaking. Then there are various strategies that the autonomy survival style develops to manage that. And then finally, in the fifth survival style, the love sexuality, you can see that love is part of the missing or the compromised core capacity, because in intimate relationships, in particular, they've experienced that it's dangerous to open their heart to another. And so these individuals, as I've said in many different contexts, could be very high functioning, very successful, but in intimate relationships, they often have a great deal of difficulty opening their heart. They may be able to open it, let's say, to orphans. It's not like they're completely disconnected from their hearts, like maybe somebody who's had earlier trauma is, but in intimate relations in particular, they have a hard time being connected to their heart. And without taking too much time and going into too many details, the other element, of course, in the love sexuality survival style is sexuality. The piece that I'm going to focus on is the connection between being able to feel the connection between your heart and your sexuality. We know of a whole lot of people, and all of us maybe to some degree or another, is that often to be really sexual, we shut down our hearts. There are some people we call the romantic subtype who can be more in their hearts, but then can't integrate their sexuality with that. And so again, my basic point here is I trace kind of the relationship of the heart through all these survival styles, is how important and fundamental having the capacity to be connected to our hearts in really in all of life's situations and in all of the 5 survival styles.
As you were walking us through those, I felt the intense suffering and pain that we as humans are holding in a world that so many of us, most of us, have been impacted by many of those layers and developmental stages of heartbreak. And I just feel the gratitude for having a community like this and learning like this, that we can learn about how to try to help clients to reconnect to their hearts, and we ourselves can have support in that as well. So thanks for walking us through that, because, you know, I know that when many of us are learning about the survival styles, we see a lot of these elements in ourselves, and that can, you know, be overwhelming for people that are recognizing things in themselves that are pretty heavy.
Yeah, and Brad and I tend not to go global in these. We tend to stay focused on the psychotherapeutic process, but we can look at this lack of heartfulness worldwide in terms of what we do to each other. People who are truly connected to their heart don't murder or kill or destroy the planet. It's like, you know, I mean, we all have our issues, but this is such a central theme in, as you mentioned, Brad, in all of human suffering. And that's why it's this theme is so basic and so important from our perspective.
Yeah, I'm glad you went there, Larry, because it was something I was thinking about too, just about how vulnerability, which is part of, you know, living openly connected in our hearts, has become so difficult in this world. Because how can you live open-hearted when you're having all this violence and terror and oppression and pain? I mean, it's hard to expect people to be able to live connected to their heart when they're having to suffer and live with and adapt to all these really difficult conditions. So yeah, well, there is another conversation to have about these more global pieces, but just kind of feeling the weight of all that as you were sharing before.
And one other point to bring it a little closer to home, And for those of you who are in relationships, or of course have been in relationship, may not be now, is just how often difficult it is for us to be vulnerable with our partner, even our life partner or our spouse, that we'll often get in fights rather than share our vulnerability. We'll get angry when we're actually feeling hurt, because that keeps the heart protected. So we have so many strategies that get in the way on a global level, but on an intimate level in personal relationships, and even with our children. And certainly, many of us can trace back and see some of the lack of heartfulness that we experienced in our own upbringing by our parents, that, how these dynamics continue generation after generation.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the flip side of it is that we can generally remember the adults in our lives, maybe on one hand, that really touched us from a heart place, a teacher, a coach, a religious person, an extended family member. I mean, so we remember those. I always say, like, if you think back to your favorite teacher, let's say it was fourth grade, you had this favorite teacher. I bet you can't remember one thing you learned in that class, but you remember right away the feeling that they gave to you. And, at least in the United States right now, it's pretty tricky for teachers too. So there's a lot of stress, and makes sense why it's hard for them to meet their students from their heart space too. So,
well, it's a great point you make. I want to just piggyback on it really quick.
Yes.
Because, in other contexts, I've done this exercise with people, like, how they got to where they are. And it's always that some part of them followed their heart, like how they got to where they are in terms of their profession, how they became a psychotherapist, why they worked on themselves in the first place. This really great resource that could be an exercise that Brad just talked about is like our heart has been guiding us, whether we know it or not. And of course, there are some individuals whose heart has been so broken that they just go in, the path of destruction, both of self and others. But for other people, we have literally been following our hearts, whether or not we've known it. And that's, led us into where we are today in our lives.
So we're already talking about this topic here, but anything more we can talk about in terms of child consciousness? This is what we use in NARM to kind of describe when we're in our adaptive survival strategies. And, what can we speak more to the role that child consciousness plays when adults are closing their heart? You've mentioned being in intimate relationships. You mentioned being a parent. How about clinically, maybe, like when, what might be some of the signs we might see, or some of the obstacles with our clients when they're really showing up through this child consciousness and disconnection from heart?
We could take a very common example that comes up in people's lives in general, which is having firm boundaries, setting appropriate boundaries, saying no to people. Is when we trace the fear back, first there might be guilt about saying no, but when we trace that a little deeper, we see that underneath that guilt is actually fear. The fear is that if I show you who I really am, if I stand up to you, if I say no to you, you won't love me anymore. And this is child consciousness, because even if that fantasy turned out to be true, it meant they never loved you in the first place, if they only love you when you do what they want. But secondly, the profound fear that's associated with that, at least in most contexts, is related to what we experienced as a child. It has nothing to do with the reality of being adult human beings. Yeah, if we say no and somebody doesn't like it, it's not a fatal, even if worst case scenario, they end the relationship. But for a child, there is only at the beginning, the attachment relationship. And we carry that fantasy in our minds into adulthood. And that's what we mean when we talk here about child consciousness. It's always coming. This is a broad statement, and I'll stand by it. Closing our hearts is generally coming from, because there are just some things that are so painful for us to experience that we need to slowly open our hearts to it, because it just hurts so much. And that isn't necessarily coming from child consciousness. But in general, the kinds of dynamics like not asking for what we need, or not setting boundaries, or not telling someone we love them when we actually do, that's all these strategies are ultimately coming from child consciousness.
So both you and I have studied Wilhelm Reich's work, and he used to talk about armoring, character armor. And he talked sometimes like literally about armor around the heart. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the somatic elements of armoring in our heart.
Well, certainly we can see it on different levels. So we can see that for some individuals, their chests are literally like metal. It's so rigid and tight and hard. And that's one way of trying to protect the tender emotions, the tender heart feelings that we have. For other people, we see it a different way. That's more a hypertonic reaction. But then we see many individuals have this hypotonic, this kind of collapse reaction where you see literally the heart area, the chest area is depressed. And that's not just bad posture, as some people might want to believe. That's one way to protect all of the viscera, particularly the heart, is by shutting down this whole area in this collapsed way. So we have these two dynamics, the hypertonic and the hypotonic. And there are even subtler levels than that. For example, I don't know this firsthand, but I've learned this from people who I trust, that even the pericardium, the sac that surrounds the heart, can actually clench and tighten the heart and can literally constrict the heart. So generally when Brad and I are talking about the heart, we're talking about the heart center, not the physical heart, but it does have implications for the physical heart as well. And again, I don't know if it was true, but I do remember that, for example, one of my teachers was Al Lowen, and he used to talk about when people, he had one specific example, which I won't bring up, but of somebody who on the birth of their child had a heart attack because in his mind, I don't know if it was true or not, that they couldn't tolerate the loving feelings that they were experiencing, and it created so much distress. But we also know, even cardiologists who might not relate to much of what Brad and I are presenting here today, are completely aware of the fact that some people literally do die of heartbreak when somebody, their life partner dies, for example. For some people, it's too much. And if they can't feel the grief that's there, and often the anger, even if it's not rational, there can be anger at the person that we lost as well as grief. And if a person can't feel it and they have to shut it down, it can actually lead to a heart attack. So this is, again, profound implications. This theme has profound implications on so many levels.
I've always had a problem with this phrase, failure to thrive, because it's like placing the responsibility on a young child, like their failure to thrive. Like I'm thinking about it now from the perspective of like that child who dies in an orphanage is dying because their heart is so isolated and having to shut down in such an extreme way that they literally will die. I mean, this has been studied for many centuries at this point. And it's interesting to think of it from that perspective, that it's the same as someone who's been married for 60 years and their spouse passes away and then they have a heart attack. It's that death by heartbreak. There was a really interesting question that came in, Larry. I want to read it to you. I wonder also whether we truly know what love is when we experience these early heart disconnections and then we confuse love with other things.
Well, I think that's actually a central theme. It's one that I address regularly in both the master's and the postmaster's class. It's for many, all of us struggle with different elements of narcissism. But one of the core issues, at least for narcissism, is that we end up confusing admiration with love, so that we cultivate a certain image. And we do this in all of the survival styles. I talk about overt and covert narcissism in the masterclass. But so all of the survival styles, we have created an image that we want to believe ourselves and that we want other people to see, and creates a certain kind, it both comes from a certain kind of heartbreak in not having this, what's real and authentic in us recognized, but it creates its ongoing heartbreak because we continue to break our own hearts when we continue acting out these old strategies. It reinforces this basic belief that who I am isn't lovable. It's a very painful dynamic. And of course, those of you who are in the training recognize that I was just talking about the agency piece there, that we as adults actually continue the heartbreak process. And that isn't to blame ourselves for it in any ways. Agency is just the opposite of self-blame. But to see how we continue to do this by actively disconnecting from our hearts. Another exercise that I've sometimes given when I'm working to the groups, when I'm working with the love sexuality theme, is just to reflect on how many times you've felt love towards your partner, your friend, maybe even your child, and chose not to reveal that. because it felt too vulnerable, too scary. Or that, I've used this in other contexts. You look in on, you're a young parent, you look in on your sleeping child, and your heart starts to fill with love for this child. Then immediately you get scared and start thinking of all the terrible things that might happen. It's a very common human reaction. But all of this has to do with the challenge that we as human beings have of fully opening our hearts. And so, again, it just speaks to the centrality of this heart theme that Brad and I are addressing today.
Yeah. We've talked already a little bit about the way that closing one's heart impacts intimacy. Anything more you'd like to share about that?
Well, again, often when we're, quote unquote defensive, I say quote unquote because we don't use that term very often in the NARM work, but when we're defensive in an intimate relationship, it's often because we're feeling hurt, vulnerable, wounded. And when we don't have ways to address that, when we have to shut it down and make our client, make our partner wrong, rather than feeling our own vulnerability, these are a couple of different ways that this dynamic impacts our capacity for intimate relationship.
So we're going to start kind of shifting into the clinical a little bit in a moment, but this is a bridge here is why is this concept you started at the beginning talking about, because we're in a complex trauma community here, learning community, it's so important to bring heartfulness into this. And maybe, because this could also be nice for us to talk to our colleagues or people that like we're telling them about NARM, like one of the distinguishing factors about NARM that people find so impactful and transformative is this heartfulness quality. So maybe you can help us with this understanding a little bit more.
Well, because again, the core element, and the word core actually comes from the French word for heart. So it is such a core element in the human experience that when there's been complex trauma, developmental relational trauma, that it has had such a huge impact on the heart. And if we don't know how to address these, if we're doing manualized therapy, which doesn't then address this level of the heart, we're really missing the core, the heart again, the core of the human being. And so for NARM, heartfulness is part of the depth orientation that we have. Of course, we're hoping that symptoms improve, but we're not just here to help alleviate symptoms in our clients. We're here in NARM to look at the causes, and the cause is often found on this hurt, these injuries to the heart that we've experienced, and our inability to know how to address those in a productive way. And then, of course, all the strategies that we developed out of those to protect our heart.
Mm-hmm. So we haven't really talked so much about grieving. Obviously, the NARM emotional completion model, for those of you that have been through our trainings or read our book, know how central that is to this process, this therapeutic process. But let's focus a little bit more about the grieving process in our work.
Okay. For those of you who've been in the training, often the early part of the training is focusing on helping people integrate their anger. Now, again, if you don't know NARM ideas, we don't do catharsis, we don't hit pillows or any of that kind of thing. But we do help people recognize and integrate and understand the anger, which is part of the protest that I talked about earlier. And that's really important. But I always remind the participants in my groups that, being able to express our anger at our parents, as essential as it is in the healing process, was never the child's first wish. Children want to love their hearts. It's the natural state of things to love their parents. I say to love their parents, to love their hearts
well,
too.
That's true too.
Yeah, they want to be in their hearts. That's the natural state of who we are as human beings. There's expression in one dialect of German that says the child is all heart, and that's really pretty much true. So the point that I'm trying to make here is then that after we've integrated anger, then it's fully not just appropriate but useful to be able to grieve the parents that we never had, for example, or the childhood that we never had. And as Brad and I talk about in the trainings, real grieving is not anything like depression. It's not a shut down and frozen state. It can be painful to grieve, but when you're actively grieving, it's heart opening and enlivening, even despite the pain. And those people who are actually able to grieve their losses then can move on in their lives. If we can't grieve, then we stay stuck to whatever degree in that traumatic loss of whatever the exact theme is that we're talking about. So grieving is a part of the emotional completion process. And for many people, it's actually the final stage of the work where they're able to feel the grief and then move beyond it. So much life energy is then freed up for relationship, for creativity, for self-actualization of all kinds and all different kinds on all different levels.
I think it's a really useful reframe for clients or for any of us in our societies, like that grieving is actually a way of reconnecting to our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there is so much perspective, like that you're going to go into depression and you're going to, like, get overwhelmed and all that kind of stuff. But in fact, at least the way that we support it in NARM, it's really an opportunity to reconnect to one's heart.
Well, and the important point is to understand, and to just again to carry on with what you're saying, is that like all emotional processes, grief is a time-limited process. If it's going on forever or long, long periods of time, then it usually means that there's something else that hasn't fully been dealt with. And I've had many clients say variations of, I'm afraid if I start to cry, I'll never stop. That isn't the way emotions work, and that isn't the way emotional completion works. That isn't to say that we ever fully get over major losses in our life. We might, the loss of a brother or a sister, or the loss of a parent, or the loss of a spouse. It's not that we ever fully get beyond that, but we come back to ourselves by being able to grieve and fully feel our hearts. And many people who've had significant losses later in life often feel like they're being unfaithful to the memory of the lost loved one if they allow themselves to live again, which of course that's again coming from child consciousness. It's just not true. And if on a cognitive level, if we ask, is that what your spouse would have wanted for you, to spend the rest of your life in depression? And usually the answer is clear. No, of course they wouldn't. And, that's places that people get off track and not being able to fully finish the grieving process. And once that's finished, it doesn't mean there isn't a tenderness. But for many people who fully grieve, they become increasingly open-hearted. They become, as therapists and most of us have experienced different kinds of losses, that we bring this increasingly tender heart to our work, which allows us to be even more understanding of the pain and the suffering that our clients are experiencing.
Yeah, I have one more book recommendation. Francis Weller, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, I believe is the title. It's a beautiful book. We're trying to get him onto the podcast to talk, because he really has a very NARM-aligned perspective on grief. So thank you, Larry, for going deeper into that. Let's make sure we get to this question. What role does heartfulness play in the R in NARM, in the relational connection and intersubjective process of NARM?
Well, the very fact that to the degree that we as therapists are able to stay connected to our heart is the degree to which we're actually able to stay connected, to be there as a potential connection for our clients. Now, they may not be ready, particularly in the earlier phases of therapy, to go to their heart to the level that we are in. But on the other hand, if we're not in our hearts, it's experienced intersubjectively by the client. And if we're afraid of what we might find in our own hearts, the anger, the rage even, and the grieving, then we won't allow those states in, or even recognize those states in our clients. So it's part of what we bring as a full human being, which is important in the NARM work, what we bring as a full human being to the therapeutic process. And it creates a kind of open space then for the client, when they're ready at their own pace, to move increasingly into their own hearts. And with the knowledge, because they're reading us, whether consciously and unconsciously on all levels, they're picking up on our openness to them. And if, again, when we're doing it out of a manual, how much can we really be in our hearts when that's our focus?
Yeah. And, I just think it's important to also acknowledge that those of all of us that are really deepening into the NARM work, we're doing a lot of our own personal work as part of this process. And it takes a lot of courage. And that word also comes from the heart. It takes a lot of courage because to take our clients to places that we've never been is nearly impossible. And so us exploring these very deep heart places just is so important. And I can just speak from my own personal experience. I'm so grateful for this work, Larry, and that you've created and shared with us, and that we're now sharing with all of you, and that you're all sharing with your clients. I mean, we're growing something that is very important in terms of heart connection, that is, from our perspective, the antidote to what's happening in this world.
Yeah, another point I'd like to add to that is that those of you, again, who are in the training, is that we talk about states. And really, they're ultimately referring to states of being, but they're also heart states. And so, for example, gratitude, which many people feel after a good session, they feel this gratitude, they feel grateful for the therapist at first and want to give the therapist the credit. But this gratitude is actually a heart space. The feeling of coming back to our hearts, we always experience with gratitude. The state of compassion is also a heart space. Compassion is being able to be open-hearted there to the pain as well as the joy of others. So again, just other indications of how central this theme of the heart is in the work that we do.
This leads us perfectly into our closing exercise here, which we'd like to invite you to do is a time, it could even be now or some other time, that you have felt open-hearted and connected to your heart. And we'll just invite you to take a few moments to reflect on a time that you felt open-hearted and connected to your heart, and to really notice how that feels internally as you reflect on that. Well, it's a great topic, and appreciate having the opportunity to explore it and have a few moments to really feel into it. Larry, anything you wanted to share as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I'm hoping that everyone was able to access, some memory of that, or sometimes even just bringing up an individual face. For me, it's my granddaughter, and I think of her, my heart fills, I automatically start to smile, and I'm hoping each of you was able to find some kind of internal remembered resource that helps you to have more access to your own heart.
Those of you that are familiar with the 4 pillars, if you're not in one of our trainings, you can read about it in the book at this point, and we'll be revisiting that. And then we have these other topics that we've interspersed that you've been requesting on our Facebook, Inner Circle Facebook group. So we're really looking forward to diving into these further NARM topics with you all. So thanks again for being part of our international community here. And thanks, Larry, again for all that you've been bringing to us. And
well, thanks, Brad. It's great, again, as always, to work together.
Yeah. And we'll be seeing you very soon. Okay. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? We are excited to be kicking off trainings in early 2023 designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.